Hello everyone and welcome to the What's Shaking with Sodium webinar. My name is Melissa Holte. I'm the Food Service Associate Channel Manager for Healthcare at General Mills, and I'll be your host. We're happy to bring you this webinar today in partnership with the Bell Institute of Health and Nutrition and the General Mills Food Service Culinary Division. For those of you less familiar with the Bell Institute of Health and Nutrition, it's a team of food and nutrition experts within General Mills whose mission is to be the source of health, nutrition, and wellness expertise that creates value and growth for General Mills. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping matters. First, this webinar is being recorded. The recorded webinar, along with today's slides, will be available to you after the presentation. Within the next week, you'll receive an email with the links to the recorded webinar, the slides, your CEU certificate, and a survey. As a reminder, you must log into the webinar with your individual credentials to receive credits for today's webinar. Second, you will need to use sound through your computer versus the call-in 800 number to hear the culinary video portion in part 2 of today's webinar. Finally, at the end of today's webinar, we'll have a Q&A session. You may submit questions at any time by using the chat feature located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. And now, it's my pleasure to introduce today's distinguished presenters. Our first speaker, Amy Lowe, is the Senior Nutrition Scientist at General Mills Bell Institute of Health and Nutrition. She supports the Global Science and Regulatory Affairs team on topics related to food and nutrition policy and regulation, including nutrition label reform, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, front-of-pack labeling, and sodium. Amy received her bachelor's degree in dietetics from the University of Kentucky and her master's degree in human nutrition from Michigan State University. Our second speaker is Gilles, corporate chef within food service at General Mills. Gilles joined the General Mills culinary team in December of 2013 as a corporate chef and brought with him an extensive range of experience. He completed his culinary training at the EHPN Culinary Arts and Hotel Industry Management School in Belgium, then went on to work for several classical French restaurants and hotels. After relocating to Minnesota in 2006, Gilles worked for Hilton Resorts and Hotels, the Minneapolis Club, Windows on Minnesota, and was most recently executive chef for a line of hospitals in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. In today's webinar, Amy will cover in part 1 some background on sodium, as well as the policy behind sodium guidelines and recommendations. Then in part 2, Gilles will show you some tips for reducing sodium and strategies for healthful cooking, including low sodium recipes and resources from a video shot in the General Mills Food Service Culinary Kitchens. With that, I will now welcome Amy Lowe. Amy, over to you.
Thanks so much, Melissa, for that great introduction, and good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to kick off this webinar today and to be talking to you about a topic that I know I've spent a lot of time on over the years, and especially this last year, as the FDA has had a busy time from a regulatory perspective. Sodium has certainly and definitely been an interesting nutrient to watch over the last few years as both the science and the public health policy recommendations have evolved. As healthcare providers, many of you are already familiar with sodium reduction because you have to help patients with disease states that, of course, require reduced sodium diets. For example, people with renal failure or people following a heart health diet. Also, hospitals are an extension of your community, and you can certainly serve as a best practice example of healthy lifestyles. So what we're going to do today is spend a few minutes reviewing some of the basics of sodium just to get us all in the same place, and then how it relates to the body and food. But what we're going to spend most of my allotted time looking at is a little bit of a deeper dive into sodium policy, how the policy evolves, and how policy impacts public health recommendations and regulations specific to sodium. So first of all, back to the very beginning, let's talk a little bit about salt versus sodium and what's the difference. Well, salt, as probably all of you know, is made up of about 40% sodium and 60% chloride. And all the various kinds of salt that you can find in the marketplace today really follow this same percentage, whether it's sea salt, kosher salt, pickling salt, or whatever kind of salt people pick up. It's all 40% sodium and 60% chloride. There are some minor differences, but it's pretty minimal, and it's based on the type of the mineral makeup and the crystal size. In terms of the functions of the body, it's important to remember that sodium is an essential mineral that's required for the body to function properly. Sodium plays many key roles, and I've just listed a few here. You're probably very familiar with these. Sodium helps the body maintain fluid balance and adequate hydration. It helps transmit nerve impulses. It influences contraction and relaxation of the muscles. And of course, the kidneys work to regulate sodium balance. And there are many conditions that can influence how the body's handling of sodium is impacted. Let's talk a little bit, too, about high blood pressure and sodium. High blood pressure is a risk factor for many diseases, including heart disease, diabetes, stroke, and other chronic conditions. The body of scientific evidence does show that there is a health improvement for many people if they reduce sodium and blood pressure. But it's also important to remember that there are many lifestyle modifications that can help control blood pressure and reduce the risk of chronic disease. For example, maintaining a healthy weight and getting regular physical activity is extremely important. Also, increasing potassium intake, making sure to avoid smoking, and then limiting alcohol and stress can be very impactful. I think the point that's really important to remember in all this is that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach for people, and sodium is just one aspect of this equation. As we approach patients, it's important to remember all of the things that might be helpful to them. We're going to switch gears for a minute and talk a little bit more about sodium in food and beverages, but first there's a polling question. What is the role of sodium in foods and beverages? A, food preservation and safety, B, as a stabilizer, C, as a binder, and D, all of the above. And we're just going to take about 30 to 60 seconds and see what the polling questions say. You can see results coming in. Hopefully you can see them too. Looks like the proverbial all of the above is winning, although food preservation and safety is also getting a lot of votes. Just a couple more seconds. All right, it looks like the answers are in. About 70% of you said all of the above, which is the right answer, so good job, everyone. But of course, it is also probably most known for food preservation and safety, so that response is certainly not wrong. So, really quickly, let's take a closer look at the role that sodium plays in foods. It's certainly important for food preservation and safety, including preventing spoilage and also improving the shelf life of many products, especially shelf-stable products on shelf. Sodium is really important in texture. It's part of sodium-based leaveners that provide the characteristic texture to biscuits, cookies, cakes, and other baked goods. Sodium acts in fermentation control, is a stabilizer. It helps with color development. It's really important for leavening. Salt is used in baked goods as either the key component of the leavening agent or else as a dough conditioner for those products that are raised with yeast. And of course, the most popular usage is for increasing palatability and enhancing other flavors. It's important to remember as you're looking at sodium reductions in your establishments that it's involved in many key parts of food, flavor, development, and safety, and it's also interrelated and complex, which makes it really difficult to decrease sodium. We're going to take a look now at sodium intakes and how they compare from a U.S. perspective to a global perspective. We all know how difficult it can be to collect and measure accurately food and nutrient intakes. That is a very difficult task. So this map is really just meant to be a bird's eye view of global intakes. The data is not all collected in the same way in all regions, and certainly some regions, such as areas of Africa and Asia, do not have an accurate way to gather intakes. So truly it's meant to be a bird's eye view. But I think the important thing to look at is how prevalent the color yellow is in this map. So yellow represents intakes of sodium of between 3,400 milligrams per day and about 4,800 milligrams per day. And most of the industrialized nations have intakes in that region. There's a few countries that are in the blue region, which is the lower intakes, and a few also in the higher regions, which represent the red and the orange intakes. But most of the most industrialized nations have intakes in that yellow area. And the United States is included in that, where our intakes are roughly 3,400 milligrams per day. If we take a closer look at U.S. intakes and focus more on where sodium specifically is coming from, this pie chart represents the various different food groups and where sodium intake is coming from. And a key thing that I want you to take away from this chart is that sodium is coming from all the different areas of our diets and not just one in particular, although mixed dishes certainly do make up a big percent of this pie. Sodium intake follows calorie intake. So it's really not surprising that mixed dishes are a key part of where we get our sodium in this country, because it includes such a wide array of foods, including pizza, burgers, sandwiches, casseroles and other mixed dishes, grain and pasta dishes, soups, tacos, etc. So many key foods that Americans get significant numbers of calories from are also providing significant amounts of sodium. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit and get really into the policy behind all of this. And I think before we dig into that, let's take a little bit of time to talk about why we're talking about sodium policy. So science in all areas outside of health and nutrition is continuing to evolve with new research, and certainly health and nutrition is no exception. The science in health and nutrition is also evolving. There's been newer science in the last few years that is adding to the body of evidence on sodium. And the evolution of this sodium science is driving policy and regulatory changes. Public health recommendations for sodium are based on the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And those recommendations are fairly aligned at 2,300 milligrams per day. The Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, has also taken recent regulatory actions that's aligned with 2,300 milligrams of sodium, and we'll talk more about that as well. However, there are some organizations and special interest groups that continue to pressure for further reduction to 1,500 milligrams of sodium a day, and we're going to look at the science around that. Because there is a little bit of a conundrum where the newer evidence is suggesting that lowering sodium intake too much could possibly increase a person's risk for some health problems. This chart shows a sprinkling of sodium activities and recommendations from a high level over the last 20 to 30 years. And really it serves as a key point, one key point that this serves to illustrate is how slowly it really does take public federal nutrition and health policy to evolve. And that is actually by design. In the United States, there is a very defined and regulated process to ensure that public health recommendations are based on the preponderance of scientific evidence and expert scientific agreement. Despite the sometimes public conversations around sodium and what intake recommendations should be, there has actually been not very much change to the real number around the public health recommendation from a federal government standpoint. If you look at the 1990s, that number of trying to have 2,400 milligrams per day of sodium or less is not that different than the 2015 Dietary Guidelines number of 2,300 milligrams per day or less. But certainly a lot has happened in between there. The Dietary Guidelines for 2005 and 2010 were aligned at 2,300 milligrams per day. But a special call out in 2010 was a recommendation for special populations to get 1,500 milligrams of sodium a day or less. In 2013, there was a key report from the Institute of Medicine that came out that we'll talk a little bit more about that provided some more context and newer research around the 2,300 milligram per day recommendation. Also, in 2014, and then finalizing in 2016, FDA proposed and then finalized an update to the Nutrition Facts Panel where their daily value for sodium was revised from the 2,400 set in 1990 to the 2,300, which you'll see coming out on new labels soon. So, how does federal nutrition and health policy evolve in the United States? Well, it's all based on the United States Dietary Guidelines for Americans. This is the key public policy cornerstone of U.S. nutrition policy and regulation. So it's really important to understand how those recommendations in the Dietary Guidelines evolve. The Dietary Guidelines influence FDA and nutrition labeling, such as the Nutrition Facts Panel. They influence USDA federal feeding programs like school lunch and school breakfast and the WIC program. And of course, globally, our dietary guidelines have an influence on other nations as their eating policy and recommendations evolve. The Dietary Guidelines are updated every 5 years by an appointed group of experts called the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. And their job is to look at the preponderance of scientific evidence and make any updates that they see necessary to the Dietary Guidelines. The sodium recommendations in the latest Dietary Guidelines, the 2015 Dietary Guidelines, were based largely on recommendations from the 2005 Dietary Reference Intake Report, and then also the 2013 Institute of Medicine report sodium intakes in populations, the assessment of evidence. So we're going to look a little bit more into that nuance behind those two dietary guideline recommendations, the 2010 report and the 2015 report. Because at first glance, as you look at this chart, you can see that there's really not a whole lot of difference if you look big picture. But if you dive a little bit more into the weeds, there are some important nuances. For example, in both 2010 and 2015, sodium was identified as a nutrient to limit. The recommendation for sodium in both 2010 and 2015 was to try to reduce sodium to less than 2,300 milligrams per day for the general population. In 2010, there was an additional recommendation for subpopulations to reduce sodium to 1,500 milligrams per day. And this is where the change and the nuance is lying. In 2010, the special population group was adults 51 and over, African Americans, or anyone with hypertension, diabetes, or chronic kidney disease. In 2015, they also had a 1,500 milligram recommendation for subpopulations, but those subpopulations were only for adults with prehypertension or hypertension. In 2010, the evidence and science was based on blood pressure, which is known as a marker of disease risk. And also it was the recommendations from that 2005 Dietary Reference Intake Report. In 2015, the difference was the recommendations were based on direct health outcomes versus blood pressure as a marker, and also the data that was reviewed in the 2013 Institute of Medicine report, in addition to the 2005 Dietary Reference Intake Report. So that 2013 report from the Institute of Medicine was really key in driving some health public policy recommendation changes. So let's take a little bit more closer look at those details in that 2013 report and understand what the significance of those were, because that's where the nuance of the change in recommendation lies. So first of all, a little background on this 2013 report and why it was done. So since the 2010 Dietary Guidelines have been released, there have been many new studies that were done that were generating considerable dialogue and conversation in health communities about whether sodium reduction in the population actually increases the risk of adverse health effects and outcomes. So the Institute of Medicine, based on this newer evidence, was tasked with looking at the latest body of research on sodium intake and health outcomes in the general U.S. population, and also specifically among people with hypertension and prehypertension, people that were 51 plus, African Americans, and people with diabetes, chronic kidney disease, and congestive heart failure. So that was the special subpopulation group from 2010. So the Institute of Medicine looked specifically at those populations. The committee was also asked to comment on implications of the newer evidence for population-based strategies to gradually reduce sodium intake and to identify gaps in the research and ways to address them. So the committee looked at the most recent studies, and importantly, they reviewed sodium's impact on direct health outcomes like heart disease and death versus just blood pressure as a surrogate marker. And that was a key difference. So the key conclusions that I've highlighted in this slide are that the newer studies do support previous findings that reducing sodium from high levels does help moderate levels and improve health. The new studies also suggest that lowering sodium intake too much may increase the risk of some health problems. And the evidence does continue to support a relationship between higher sodium intake and risk of heart disease that's consistent with the blood pressure research. Sodium on direct health outcomes does not support recommending intakes below 2,300 milligrams a day for the general population. Additionally, the studies on direct health outcomes did not support lowering sodium intake within the population subgroups to less than 1,500 milligrams a day. So there's the difference in the recommendation from the 2010 Dietary Guidelines to the 2015 Dietary Guidelines. The Institute of Medicine Committee also recommended that future research was needed to zero in more on that association between the lower levels of intake, for example, between 1,500 and 2,300 milligrams per day, and direct health outcomes. So in summary, the reason this report was so important is that it recognized the latest research and helped evoke a significant change in public health recommendations. So let's take a look at how these policy recommendations turn into action from a regulatory standpoint. If you remember from the earlier slide, the Dietary Guidelines impacts food and nutrition labeling. And a key place you'll see that in action is on the Nutrition Facts panel. You may be aware that recently the FDA finalized changes to the Nutrition Facts panel, and it's the biggest change to be coming to the nutrition labeling in over 20 years. The change is small. Probably most consumers won't necessarily see it, but the daily value for sodium is changing from 2,400 milligrams to 2,300 milligrams. Most percent daily values will not change because of this change is so slight, but a few might. And I've picked an example here. I had to actually make one up because it was hard to find one that worked in real life. But this example here, if the sodium in this product per serving is 250 milligrams per serving, the current daily value is 10% based on 2,400 milligrams per day. When the daily value reduces to 2,300 milligrams per day, for this product, the daily value will increase to 11%. So consumers might be somewhat confused because they won't understand that the product necessarily hasn't changed. It's really just the value that has changed. So that might be one place where you'll have to provide some education to consumers. This change will start to be rolling out any time now, and the required change is not happening until July of 2018. So these labels will be rolling out slowly over the next couple years and then probably increasing in speed as we get closer to July 2018. Additional activity from a regulatory standpoint from the FDA is that in early June, FDA issued draft voluntary guidance on short-term and long-term sodium targets for 150 food categories from both a retail and restaurant perspective. The short-term goal, or the short-term category target goal, is meant to reduce population sodium intakes to roughly 3,000 milligrams per day, while the long-term goal was to reduce sodium to 2,300 milligrams per day, which is, again, the recommendation from the Dietary Guidelines. The comment period on this draft guidance was completed in early December, and at this point it's unclear what FDA's timing or next steps will be, because the process is quite different for guidance than it is for regulation. And these, again, were guidance and they were voluntary, so it's unclear what will be happening next and what the timing will be. The other key thing to be looking out for is on a policy directive, in that the Dietary Reference Intake Review for sodium and potassium discussions are underway for an update to this. Again, it was last updated in 2005, and there's a proposed review that would potentially begin in the fall of 2017. So that's certainly in the future, but something to be looking out for as we continue to watch sodium science evolve. Time for another polling question. The question is, what is the new daily value for sodium on the Nutrition Facts label? 1,500 milligrams of sodium, 2,000 milligrams, 2,300 milligrams, or 2,400? Looks like people are chiming in, and most are going with C, 2,300, which would be correct. 2,400 is the current daily value, and the change will be going to 2,300. So in summary, sodium plays a critical role as an essential nutrient and as a key functional ingredient in foods. Globally, sodium intakes are generally higher than recommended, with the U.S. intake being around 3,400 milligrams per day, which is similar to other nations. The recent Institute of Medicine review on direct health outcomes do not support sodium intakes below 2,300 milligrams per day for the general population. Key policy and regulatory recommendations are aligned at reducing sodium to 2,300 milligrams per day for the general population, and that's reflected in both the 2015 Dietary Guidelines and also FDA's update to the Nutrition Facts panel, the daily value for sodium. Future activity around sodium is anticipated, but the timing is not clear, so it's something to stay tuned for. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Gilles, who's going to show you some low sodium cooking techniques.
Hello, thanks, Amy, and once again, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day to tune in with us for an hour on our What's Shaking with Sodium webinar. So once again, my name is Gilles, and in part 2 of the webinar, I'm going to take you through a few different recipes as well as cooking techniques that I have put in together to help you with solutions in reducing sodium within your facility. It will be at our General Mills kitchen, and that's where we're going to go for those videos. But before we start, I would like to ask you another quick poll question, which is, what do you rely on most to enhance flavor of lower sodium food in dishes? Would it be herbs, spices, salt replacers, or cooking techniques? Kind of trying to get some insights from you guys. And I see some of the answers are coming in right now. We'll give you another 10-15 seconds to close before I close the poll. All right, I'll close it now. Thank you so much, everyone, for giving us some answers. So it looks like spices have come up on top, followed by herbs. We have some salt replacer next, and cooking techniques finally is the least used, but I think it's a great one as well. So let's go to the culinary kitchen and watch some videos quickly.
Hello, my name is Gilles Stassert, and I'm joining you this morning from our General Mills World Headquarters in Minneapolis, Minnesota. First, I wanted to thank you very much for taking the time to join us and be part of our webinar on What's Shaking with Sodium. In the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to go through a few recipes that I will demonstrate to you because I think they are great recipes to reduce sodium when you're trying to find solution for your room service menu. Let's get started. This recipe I'm going to show you now is a great alternative to the traditional breakfast food that you could purchase, let's say, for one of those famous chains around the nation. So what we're going to do is make a breakfast sandwich using our gold medal all-grain complete pancake mix. So what the complete in this means is that the only thing you have to do to make delicious all-grain pancakes is add some water. So I portioned the two ingredients that we will need right here. So doing a quarter of the box recipe, we're going to need 4 cups of our gold medal whole grain pancake mix, as well as 2 1/4 cups of water. So as all of our mixes, we start by pouring the entire amount of water in the bottom of the bowl, and then we're going to pour the entire amount of our gold medal mix over the water. And then we're going to start mixing using a whisk until all the mix is nicely incorporated to the water. So this should take about 30 seconds. And knowing that we are working with a whole grain mix in this particular case, you have to realize that there will be some little bit of particles of the whole grain left in the batter when you're done stirring. So here, if you look at it, and we've been mixing for about 20 seconds now, you can see that the water and the mix are getting to be one nice batter, almost smooth. And at this point, we are ready to let it sit for a few minutes. I like to let it sit so the whole grain really soften, and it makes really nice, delicious, and fluffy pancake. So here on my left side, we've got some batter that has been resting for a few minutes, and you can see now it's really close to being really smooth and ready to be poured on our griddle. So we're going to put a little bit of spray down on the griddle before pouring the pancake. And then what I do is I use a 1.5 ounce ladle to make sure that the size of my pancakes is appropriate with the size of the breakfast sandwich we're trying to make. Using pancake mix instead of biscuits, for example, will significantly reduce the sodium level that we are going to have in this dish, and will really be something that's good for our patients to eat. So on the top here, you have some pancakes that I've already griddled off a minute ago. So we'll take those off and put them on our clean work surface right here. And then what I'm going to do is simply grab the fillings from my oven, which in this case, we're going to put some eggs. I made some nice little egg patties right there. And then we are also going to put some low-sodium sausage in the middle. So just like building a biscuit sandwich, you start with your bottom, you place your egg, then we'll place some of our low-sodium sausage patty. And then a trick I like to do is to put a little bit of maple syrup on top of the sausage, just so it stays moist throughout the travel that might happen between the kitchen and the room of your patient. So I build it like this, and then all you have to do is place it on a plate. I like to do some kind of low garnish like oranges, and then now it's ready to go to the room. Using our original Mountain High yogurt, we're going to make 3 different recipes that are in front of me that will be replacing our traditional blue cheese dressing, ranch dressing, and sour cream. So the ingredients that we're going to place in our ranch dressing are going to be our original Mountain High yogurt. We have a little bit of the garlic powder, onion powder. We've got some of the parsley I just chopped, some dill, some chives, and we also have some of the no-salt seasoning that I'm sure all of you carry in your pantry. Then, moving on to our blue cheese dressing, we're going to start with some chopped up garlic, some honey, a little bit of honey for a little sweetness to it. We're going to do some no-salt seasoning again. What I put in this yogurt blue cheese dressing is a little bit of cayenne pepper as well. That will really help replacing the sodium or salt that you don't have in there by giving it a little kick. And then finally, if you talk to your distributor and can locate some lower sodium blue cheese dressing, that is an option that we're going to place in there as well. And finally, a little squeeze of lemon. Okay, so let's get going. Grab a bowl and a whisk, and we're going to start with the ranch dressing. So what I'm going to do is open our Mountain High plain yogurt, which you can see in here. I'm going to do 2 scoops to start. There you go. So you can see that the Mountain High is a nice shape, kind of the perfect texture that you'll be looking for to make a replacement for a traditional dressing. Then we'll place a little bit of our garlic powder. We'll do our onion powder. Then we'll place the chopped up parsley I just did in there. Some of the dried dill. We'll do some dried one. You don't need to have all herbs fresh, but it certainly adds to the flavor of the dressing if you do have some of these herbs being fresh. And then we'll put a little bit of our no-salt seasoning in there. There you go. Next step would be to start stirring our dressing together. And it's got a great, great consistency. So really, it's even on the thicker side, so a little bit like some ranch dressing are. So here's for the ranch dressing. Then we're going to move on to our blue cheese dressing. So kind of like the same procedure, really. We'll do 2 scoops of our Mountain High yogurt right here to start. Then we're going to go down our list of ingredients once again. So we have some of the fresh chopped up garlic in here. If you prefer not to use garlic a lot, I know that a lot of hospitals try to stay away from fresh garlic. You can substitute it for garlic powder or maybe take it out altogether. It will still have very good flavor. Then we're going to add our honey in there, some of our no-salt seasoning. A little bit of the cayenne pepper, as I said earlier, really will help the flavor of this dish. And then we'll put all of our low-sodium blue cheese, or lower sodium, should I say, blue cheese in there. And then I'll squeeze a tiny bit of lemon in there just to add a little bit of a touch of freshness to it. And then just like the ranch dressing, we're just going to stir it up until it's nicely incorporated all together. I like to mix this one a little bit longer just so the blue cheese chunks kind of get a little smaller, so there is blue cheese in every bite that you'll be taking. All right. So this is a great substitution for your regular blue cheese dressing, and we'll go with crudité or like carrot stick or celery stick or something like that, as well as serve it with your salads. And then finally, what I wanted to talk to you about is sour cream. So I know that in hospitals, sour cream is really popular because you serve a lot of Mexican dishes, for example. So this Mountain High yogurt will be a great substitution for your original sour cream. And this will definitely be something that you can serve in a little ramekin next to your Mexican dish for your patient to enjoy. It definitely has a lot less sodium as well as fat compared to your traditional sour cream. So what I would do is simply do a scoop, place it in a ramekin, and if you look at it, you can see that it holds its shape perfectly. So this is not going to be a huge surprise to your patient when this comes with their tray of food. It's not like you're serving them a runny yogurt. So this definitely will be something that's acceptable to them. So if I go over what we just talked about, we've got our ranch substitute, our blue cheese substitute, as well as our sour cream substitute. And like I told you, this is definitely one of my favorite foods, so I got to try it now. Delicious.
All right, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the first two recipes that I just displayed in front of you. Definitely the pancake sandwich I love because not only is it lower in sodium, but it's also a really cool, trendy recipes that you can use on your room service menu, for example. And the dressings are great too. My favorite would be the ranch. Here's another poll question. If you can take a second to answer it. It is, what is the biggest challenge your facility faces with serving low-sodium recipes? The first answer could be lack of training or lack of recipe IDs or lack of fresh herbs or lack of spices. And I'll give you a few seconds to answer this question as well. Thank you for participating. All right, I see lots of answers coming in. Looks like the first two bullet points are kind of winning so far. I'll give you another 10 seconds so everybody get a chance to answer it. And then we will be going back in the kitchen and do a couple additional recipe demonstration. Also, feel free to ask questions in the chat bar on the bottom. All right, I'll close the poll. And looks like the two tops are kind of side by side, lack of training and lack of recipe IDs. So let's go back in the kitchen and we can give you some more recipe IDs that you can use after the webinar. There you go.
Basically, anything with crispy chicken on top of it is definitely something that's popular. So what I'm going to teach you today is how can you make a breaded chicken breast that will still be delicious and crispy, but will be a lot healthier for you, have a lot less sodium, and also, on top of it all, it will be gluten-free. We can thank Rice Check for this all. So what we're going to do first, for this recipe, it's basically the exact same that making a traditional breading. So we're going to start by making our breadcrumbs, if you will, by using our Rice Checks. And I'll put them inside of one of our food processor over here. Next up, I'll put our lid, and then let's get this a good grind so it's got kind of like the same texture than regular breadcrumbs. All right, that looks good. I chopped up some fresh parsley in there. It doesn't really add too much flavor to your chicken breast, but it surely will look nice. So here it is. We'll put some of the Rice Chex crumbs with our parsley. That should do it. Perfect. So as you can see, I have marinated this chicken overnight. So what I did is I used lots of fresh herb, such as thyme. We've got some rosemary sprig in there. And we've got also a little bit of that no salt added seasoning that we've talked about earlier. So what I did is I made sure that my chicken breasts were nice and the perfect size that I wanted, which is about 3 ounces in this case. Then I added our fresh herbs, and then I just added a little bit of milk and water over it all, just to make sure that it's moist enough so the breadcrumbs or the rice check crumbs are going to stick to the chicken. So the next step to do is to use a little bit of our cooking spray. So let's grab a chicken breast from our pan right here. We'll then place it on top of our rice checks, and then what I like to do is just bring some more on the top, and I press lightly on both sides. So as you can see, the chicken breast is perfectly coated on both sides. So what I'm going to do next is just place it on my nice warm pan over here. And we're going to let it saute for a couple minutes until it's a little bit brown on each side before we place it in the oven. So now that our chicken has been cooking for about 2 minutes, we're going to flip it. Oh, there you go. And look how beautiful that is. A little bit of brown right there. Just good enough. Then we're going to leave it for another minute on the other side, and then we're going to put it in the oven. It looks like it's been about another minute, so what I'm going to do next is just grab my pan and go to the oven. Perfect. And then you can see that about 8 minutes later, what comes out of the oven is this beautiful browned up chicken breast that is perfectly cooked. And then I'm going to place it on my cutting board. And what we're going to do is just give it one cut so we can shingle it nicely on the plate that you're going to serve it. What I've done is prepared a nice little salad that we will serve with our rice checks breaded chicken breast. A little bit of spring mix. I've got a little bit of tomatoes, a little bit of the lemon, a couple slices of lemon just so you can squeeze it on that chicken breast if you wish. And then we're going to serve it with some of the ranch dressing that we prepared earlier. And what you can do is if you flip the chicken breast over, you can see that the bottom of the pan is baked a little bit more than the top as well in the oven. So that will be nice and crispy for your patient to enjoy. There you go. This was our rice checks breaded chicken breast. All right, now we're going to make our butternut squash soup. I'm very excited about this recipe because it's one of my favorite, if not my favorite recipe that we have on our website. So basically, what I have in front of me is what we're going to use to make our gluten-free butternut squash soup. It's got great advantages to it to serve to your patients because not only is it gluten-free, but on top of it, it has a lot less sodium than if you were to buy a convenience product, for example. I'll put a little bit of olive oil, just a touch, in my pan, and we're going to sweat our yellow onions first in there. There you go. You can hear the little sizzling in there. I have diced the onion in this particular case, but really it's not necessary if you just want to quarter them or julienne them or anything that's fast will work as well. In the meantime, though, I will start cutting our potatoes. So I have 2 yellow potatoes in this particular case. And once again, the way you cut them is not that important, as long as they're able to cook in the pan that you're using. So it's been about 3 to 4 minutes now. And the onions, as you can see, have gotten a tiny bit of color, but they are becoming really nice and tender. So what I'm going to do next is add our potatoes to it. Give it a little stir, and then using the same temperatures that I was using for the onion, I'm going to let them cook just a few minutes, 5 to 6 minutes, until they become to be a little bit soft as well. I'm using low sodium chicken stock to make this soup, just so we're sure that we're not adding some sodium that you didn't mean to be in there. So you can see the potatoes have started to soften a little bit. So I think now is a good time to add our chicken stock. Oh yeah, look at that, beautiful. Our chicken stock as well as our butternut squash. So what I did for this is simply peeled a butternut squash and then I diced it up. Here it goes. If you prefer, you can use IQF frozen. They tend to have a little bit less sweetness, but if you have to, you can add a little bit of brown sugar to it to kind of balance that sweetness. We're going to wait for about 45 minutes to an hour to let this beautiful soup simmer slowly. Okay, so now it's been about 50 minutes since the bubble started going, and you can see that this is exactly what we're looking for, an even cooking of all the ingredients. So what I'm going to do is grab a spoon or a knife or something and just make sure that our butternut squash are cooked through, which they are nice and soft. So what we want to do next is add our spices to it before we blend the soup. So we've got some cinnamon. We'll add that on there. We've got a little bit of nutmeg. Here we go. And then we've got some cloves as well. There you go. All right, so now I'm just going to give it a quick stir, such as this. And our next step is going to blend our soup together in a commercial blender before we focus on adding the creaminess to this delicious soup with our Mountain High original yogurt. So I'll grab the soup and I'll go to the blender and then I'll be right back. Here's what our beautiful butternut squash soup looks like after we just blended it up together. So you can see how nice and smooth it is, but we have to add, of course, our creaminess, our dairy note to it to make it you know, the proper butternut squash soup. So instead of using heavy whipping cream or the traditional half and half that you would put throughout the cooking process, what we're going to do is fold in to our blended soup some of our original Mountain High yogurt. This will, of course, serve many purposes. It will add the flavor profile that you're looking for, but also it will not add way more fat than what you're looking for. So what we're going to do is we have about 6 cups of the blended soup here. We're going to add 2 cups of our yogurt to it. So here we go. We'll add that. And then all I'm doing is folding in the soup. An important thing to not do is to fold in yogurt when you're on high heat. It will probably separate. So what you want to do is make sure that you fold in your yogurt once the cooking process is over. All right, so now I've been stirring for a little bit here, and you can see that the yogurt lumps have gone away. So it's safe to say that we're ready to serve this soup. So the next step will be for me to simply pour it inside of a bowl and garnish it before we serve it. So, and then what I want to do is kind of give it a little bit of pop of color to the top. So what I'm going to do is add a little bit of our Mountain High yogurt over it. What I like to do is just drizzle it randomly so it kind of looks like a nice design when your patient receives this, such as this. There you go. What I do is I will drizzle a little bit of fresh chives on there as well. So after the simple steps that we've done, we end up with this delicious butternut squash soup that's gluten-free, lower in fat due to the fact that we used our Mountain High, and hopefully delicious. Let's give it a try. Fantastic. You've got to try this recipe.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for watching those videos again, and I'm really happy we ended up finishing with the butternut squash soup because it truly is my favorite recipe on our website, as well as a lot of the employees that have tried it before. So I really recommend you try that. So quick recap here about what we just talked about in part 2 of the webinar. As I love to share what I see out there when I visit accounts such as yourself, or things that I have learned when I managed hospitals myself. So what I always like to talk about is the substitution of product to start with, because there's a lot of ways to reduce sodium on your menu by just doing simple substitution on the product you're using to make your recipes. So I really recommend when you create menu or recipes to just kind of look around at the different options that you have and kind of pick the best options that will deliver delicious foods for your patient, but also have the lowest sodium possible. Then the ingredient sourcing, there's tons of different ingredients out there, lots of different options for the same product, so definitely kind of do your study before picking any ingredient as well. One of my favorite parts was to, and is still, to add some ingredients that kind of add a little bit of color, make the dish more appealing, but also really changes the flavor profile of what you're cooking. So by simply using fresh produce, fresh herbs, or if it's cost prohibitive and you prefer to use dry herbs, you can do that as well. But by just picking some of those fresh kind of like color and pop of flavor into any of your dish, you will really change the end result without adding any salt to it. And then also, one of the things that I didn't use enough when I was running my hospitals is to simply use the resources that are available to you. There's so many places such as General Mills that give great resources that you can use. I really recommend also that you become great friend with your local distributor so they can help you source the best possible ingredient at the best price, so you can definitely create outstanding food for your patients. Also, there was a question about the availability of the recipes. We will definitely have all those recipes as well as the presentation available to you later on after this webinar is over. I will now pass it back, now that the recap is done, to Melissa for our Q&A session.
Awesome. Thank you, Amy and Gilles, for your presentations. As you mentioned, we're going to start the Q&A session. We've received a few questions. So if you'd still like to submit a question, use the chat feature. And with that, our first question is for Amy. Amy, what are the concerns regarding sodium intake levels at or below 1,500 milligrams for the general population?
Great question. The 2013 IOM report is what we're going to look at for that response. And that report looked at direct health outcomes versus blood pressure as a measure of disease risk. And the direct health outcomes that the Institute looked at were things like heart disease, stroke, mortality, morbidity, so really the direct impact. And what the studies that they reviewed showed were that studies on health outcomes were inconsistent in quality and insufficient in quantity to conclude that lowering sodium intakes below 2,300 milligrams per day, so that would be below 1,500 too, either increases or decreases the risk of heart disease, stroke, or all-cause mortality in the general U.S. population. So the evidence wasn't conclusive or consistent or enough. So really, there raised questions about, lowering sodium recommendations for the general public too much. So, and also the need for future research on direct health outcomes versus blood pressure.
Okay, great. Thank you. Gilles, we have a few questions for you. Do you always list the herbs and spices in your recipes?
Yeah, every recipe that we put on our website or that I give to any of our customers always has every single ingredient that will be part of the final dish. The only thing that we sometimes do is add a little tip on the bottom if for garnish or something like that, that may not be listed in the actual ingredients, but if you respect the recipe itself, every ingredient that's in it will be listed in the ingredients with the quantity and the volume.
Okay. Great, thank you. Next question. Any tips on convincing patients that the low sodium options may be good?
That's a tricky one. Okay, so I guess what I used to do and that I thought worked really well to kind of get the buy-in on the patient side is to convince the nurses first. So every time I changed my menu or created something new, like a special or anything like that, I had a meeting with the nursing unit in each hospital to have them try the food first, give us some feedback, and then kind of around what the feedbacks were, we created the recipes that were later on put on the menu. So that's definitely something that can help you because the nurses have the most contact with the patients, so they definitely tell them things about the food you're serving. And then kind of focusing around the food that you know people love in your particular region is important. Kind of just taking a classic and substituting ingredients such as I mentioned earlier would be a great way to kind of have people order what they already love but make it a little bit healthier for them, so they realize that not everything needs to be loaded in sodium to be delicious. So those would be my two most common recommendations, I think.
Sounds great. Gilles, do you have any tips for cooking and heating yogurt?
Yes. So, yeah, I see that question. So the yogurt, basically what I always do in every recipe is add it at the end, because you don't want to, what I recommend is to not boil yogurt ever. It's okay to fold in yogurt at the end when it's warm. It's okay to reheat a recipe that has yogurt, as long as you don't go and put it on a full boil. What I like to do, for example, for this soup that we made, it's a great recipe to do the day ahead and everything. Instead of rewarming it on a really high heat source, you just reheat it on a bain-marie, and that will assure that you don't have any breakage or curdling of the yogurt protein in there.
Okay, great. Thank you. One more for you, Gilles. I think we have time for a couple more. Somebody says, my patients are eating from my kitchen 3 days or less. How can we change years of bad eating in 3 days?
All right, that's a good one. I get that one asked a lot, actually. So what I usually tell people is that you're not going to change a person that's been eating the same way for years in 3 days. So what I like to do is kind of showcase what you do, and like if there's a way to do an insert in your menu or something like that to kind of showcase what the kitchen does in your hospital and the different initiatives that you've been doing to make your patient healthier. It's always a good way to start, so when the patient picks up the menu, they can see that there's actual people behind the food that's being served to them. Also, kind of showcasing some dish on the menu that's really healthy but also delicious by using the cooking techniques that were somewhat highlighted in the videos you just watched, using fresh herbs or just a pop of citrus with lemons or oranges, and then making beautiful presentation would be great. And then I also love to give the patient something to take home with them when they leave, such as a recipe kit that they can take home and then keep going on into their progress of making delicious recipes at home that are healthier for them. So maybe over time their habits will change. I also saw there was a question about, sorry, Melissa, there was a question about the Mountain High on the East Coast. So the distribution of Mountain High is pretty good around the country, but getting better day by day.
Great, thanks for addressing that. I have one for Amy. Somebody said, I thought the percent portion of the labels were being eliminated. Is that not correct?
Great question, and I'm happy to clarify. So the percent daily value portion of the label is not being eliminated. Some of the reference values that make up that percent are being revised and changed. So the percent DV will still be on the label. It's just that some of those numbers will be revised and updated. For example, sodium is going from 2,400 milligrams per day to 2,300 milligrams per day as the daily value. But great question. Lots of changes coming on nutrition on the nutrition facts label, but the percents will still continue to be there.
Okay, great. Do we have time for one more quick one? Somebody said, any seasoning recommendations other than Mrs. Dash to reduce monitor potassium intake? Gilles, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Let's see. So I guess that's kind of like the most common one. I know that other companies, not to give too many brands, but McCormick came out with a whole line of spices that do not have any sodium, but have a lot of different blends of seasoning in there that I have used in the past. And I mean, if you do have access to fresh herbs and kind of like the lemon and orange or anything of that nature, that's what I would recommend. I mean, fresh is always, it's got the most flavor added, so that would be kind of my thoughts on that.
All right. It looks like it's about time, so we're going to wrap up today's webinar on what's shaking with sodium. As a reminder, you will be receiving an email with today's presentation materials and a certificate with your CEU credits along with a short survey. Please watch for that in the next week or so. And last but not least, we invite you to visit our websites at www.generalmillscf.com and www.bellinstitute.com to explore the health and wellness resources, including the previous webinars, as well as product information and recipes specific to healthcare. Thank you for your participation in today's webinar. This concludes our program. You may now disconnect.